When considering Paul's view of the law, especially as that takes expression in the two letters where he treats that subject most fully, Galatians and Romans, one must be careful about too quickly and tacitly assuming that by works of law, Paul necessarily meant doing good works as a means of achieving salvation, then equating that with Pharisaic Judaism as a legalistic religion, and then presuming, absent a careful study of Paul's own writings, that this is what he meant by that phrase. Now, to be sure, Paul did say and said unequivocally that no one is justified by the works of the law. No argument there. But the question is, what exactly did Paul mean by works of law? That is precisely where the debate lies among Pauline scholars. The larger context of the debate relates to how Paul understood first century Judaism relative to his critique of the works of the law. The traditional interpretation, deeply rooted in the Reformation proclivity of reading Paul against the great backdrop of Luther's debate with the Roman Catholic Church, as the great exponent of the central doctrine of the Reformation, namely justification by faith, interprets the Judaism of Paul's day as a foil for that view and consequently understands first century Judaism as the champion of law-derived salvation and the inevitable legalism that such a perspective produces. As James D.G. Dunn put it in his Manson Memorial Lectures at the University of Manchester in 1982, I quote, "Since Paul's teaching on justification by faith seems to speak so directly to Luther's subjective wrestlings, it was a natural corollary to see Paul's opponents in terms of the unreformed Catholicism which Luther opposed, with first century Judaism read through the grid of the early 16th century Catholic system of merit," end quote. The problem is that when you actually investigate the evidence derived from the writings of early Judaism itself, namely the rabbinic literature, that is, when you let Judaism speak for Judaism, this Reformation portrait of Judaism assumed by the traditional interpretation of Paul does not square with the evidence. If you want to see an exhaustive treatment of the rabbinic evidence, see E.P. Sanders' Paul and Palestinian Judaism. Consequently, New Perspective scholars such as Dunn, N.T. Wright, Krister Stendahl, E.P. Sanders, and others argue that it is not so much that Paul has been misunderstood as that the picture of Judaism drawn from Paul's writings is historically inaccurate. Dunn and others argue, with considerable evidence on their side drawn from early rabbinic writings, that what is traditionally taken to be the Jewish alternative to Paul's gospel, namely a dour, draconian, dispirited religion of legalism that rendered its adherents in a catch-22 of have to but cannot, would have been hardly recognizable as an authentic expression of Judaism to first century Jews. Indeed, they argue that first century Jews did not undertake law keeping as a means of earning salvation. Rather, they undertook law keeping as an expression of their holy identity as the covenant people of God. For example, when I was a boy, my father used to scold me for bad behavior by saying, "Son, Stacy's don't behave that way." Now, he wasn't saying, "Behave that way or you're not a Stacy." Rather, he was saying, "Behave that way because you are a Stacy." Do you see the difference? New Perspective scholars, therefore, argue that the Judaism assumed by the traditional interpretation of Paul's view of the law is a false flag, a red herring, and not Judaism at all, at least as it was practiced by Paul's Jewish contemporaries. Rather, it is a parody of first century Judaism. To be sure, these scholars argue, Paul was critical of law keeping, but not law keeping as understood by the Reformation view. Rather, Paul was opposed to law keeping when keeping the law was reduced to a collection of Jewish identity markers, that is, Those ritual practices such as hand washing, circumcision, kosher eating, Sabbath observance, and the like, which, since the time of the exile, marked out Jews as Jews. Things that in and of themselves were purely external and cultic. Paul, like Jesus in Mark 7, did believe that there are some things that are holy and some things that are holy, or unholy rather. What he disbelieved was that those things were merely a matter of what was on the outside of a person. Therefore, these scholars argue, when Paul says that no one is justified by the works of law, but rather by the faith of or in Jesus Christ, Paul is saying two important things. First, no one has ever been marked out as the people of God merely by keeping purely external and ceremonial works of the law. For example, Jews were not the only ones practicing circumcision. Hence, practicing circumcision alone did not automatically mark one out as a member of God's people. And secondly, because being associated with the people of God is not about and never was about merely external and ceremonial observance, works of law, but rather faith in the God who saves and who is now saving through his son Jesus, that means that Gentiles as well as Jews can now be counted among the covenant people of God. And so the question is, who is right? The traditional interpretation of Paul or the new perspective? And on what evidence from first century Judaism is one's view based? A key passage, perhaps the key passage in this regard, is Galatians 2:16, and I quote, "Knowing that a man is not made righteous out of the works of law, rather through the faith of Jesus Christ. And we have believed on Messiah Jesus in order that we might be made righteous out of the faith of Jesus Christ and not out of the works of law. For out of the works of law shall no flesh be made righteous." My translation of Paul's Greek. Now, there are three key issues in this passage that need to be sorted out if we are to get a clearer understanding of exactly what Paul was saying about the relationship between law keeping and salvation. One, what does Paul mean when he says works of law? Two, what does Paul mean by faith of Jesus Christ? And three, what does Paul mean by justified, or as I have translated it, made righteous? First, the meaning of the works of the law. With respect to works of law, there are two different scholarly views. First, the traditional or Reformation view. By works of law, Paul means the disposition that one can do good works and thereby earn salvation. But the second view is the New Perspective view, and that is that Paul does not mean by works of law the disposition that one can do good works to earn salvation. Rather, works of law in first century Judaism meant Jewish identity markers, such things as circumcision, Sabbath observance, the kashrut, eating kosher, and so forth. Doing these works of law was what marked Jewish people out as Jews. That is, as members of the holy covenant people of God. It wasn't that first century Jews did these things in order to be saved. Jews never believed, for example, that circumcision alone saved anybody. Rather, they did these things because they were Jews. That is, these things marked them out as the people of God. Paul, on the other hand, argues that it is not doing good works or the works of law that marks one out as the people of God. Rather, it is the faith of Jesus Christ or Jesus the Messiah that does so. Consequently, even Gentiles can be a part of the covenant community because being in the covenant community is not marked out by circumcision, Sabbath observance, and kosher eating. Rather, it is marked out by the faith of Jesus the Messiah. And so the question is, which of these two perspectives seems to you to be a better understanding of what Paul means in Galatians 2:16? The second issue is faith in Jesus Christ or the faith or faithfulness of Jesus Christ. That is, the question turns on the meaning of Paul's phrase used in several places in his letters. In the Greek, that phrase is pistheos Iesu Christou. Should it be translated faith in Jesus Christ, which is how it is traditionally and popularly understood, or should it be translated the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, which is how the New International Version translates it in an alternate reading? More precisely, is the genitive phrase pisteos Jesu Christou an objective genitive, faith in Jesus Christ, or a subjective genitive, the faithfulness of Jesus Christ? If the latter is what Paul meant, and that is increasingly the consensus of Pauline scholars, then Paul said that we are made righteous by Jesus' faithful obedience to God's call that he be the suffering Messiah, rather than our belief in Jesus the Messiah, which is really just another example of works righteousness. The third question is, what is the meaning of Paul's verb dikeute, justified or made righteous? It can be translated either way. There are two perspectives on this, which correspond to the two perspectives we've talked about above, the traditional Reformation perspective and the new perspective. The Reformation perspective is this: by justified, Paul means the initial act of God in saving one. That is, God's initial act of saving a person, what we today might call conversion or becoming saved. But the new perspective is Paul did not mean God's initial act of salvation. Rather, justification or being made righteous is God's acknowledgement that someone is already a member of the covenant people of God, as though God is saying, yes, you are one of mine. I recognize you. Whether an initial acknowledgement or a repeated action of God, that is, God's saving acts, or God's final vindication of his people. And again, the question is, which of these two perspectives seems to be a better understanding of what Paul means in Galatians 2:16 and elsewhere? And so to summarize, the new perspective has raised our awareness of how deeply Luther's reading of Paul has permeated the church. Indeed, if you had never heard of Martin Luther and the Reformation, would you still read Paul the same way? The impact and influence of Luther's reading of Paul is so deep and persuasive that it is hard to hear Paul's voice come through over Luther's. When we read Paul, what we have been conditioned to hear is not Paul, but Luther saying to us. Now, what Paul means by this is, moreover, the new perspective has taught us to let first century Judaism speak for first century Judaism, rather than anachronistically interpreting first century Judaism through the filter of the late 15th century Catholic Church. But on the other hand, the traditional perspective is right when it insists that in at least some of Paul's writings, his critique of the works of the law is precisely what Luther and the traditional perspective says it is, namely a critique of legalism, the law, understood as a means of earning salvation, not merely identity markers of Jewish ethnicity. The truth, it seems, lies somewhere in between.